Beverly Lanfer. After spending the previous evening out, 24-year-old Beverly Lanfer arrived back at her new shared apartment around 1:30 a.m. on July 20, 1971. She was ready to call it a night after taking in the late-night revelers in Burlington, Vermont, a close-knit and energetic college town. As soon as she got home, she found that their shared bedroom door, which had just been decorated and unpacked after the relocation, was ajar. Beverly was positive that she had shut it to avoid waking her 24-year-old roommate Rita Curran, a Milton Elementary School second-grade teacher who was on summer vacation. Rita declined her 3 other roommates' previous invites to go out to parties at the neighborhood bars because this was her first time living without her parents, and Beverly wanted to give her some time to herself. Beverly was surprised to discover her roommate lying on the floor, her body already scarred and her face assaulted, when she entered their bedroom. Beverly alerted the other 2 housemates right away, but they weren't aware that anything was wrong in the second bedroom of the flat. Beverly didn't call the police straight away since, 3 years earlier, 911 had only become established as the primary emergency number for the American public. Rather, she used a phone operator to contact the emergency room at the medical institution. The hospital promptly contacted the nearby ambulance dispatch when Beverly informed the nurse on the other end that she thought her roommate had passed away in their apartment. The ambulance team from the Burlington Fire Department arrived at 17 Brooks Avenue in response to a medical distress call, and they immediately requested police presence since they believed a heinous crime had occurred. Along with paramedics, Officer Richard Garrow of the Burlington Police Department responded. The police officer confirmed that Rita had regrettably passed away by the time they arrived, and the entire apartment was now the scene of a homicide rather than a medical emergency. Before we continue, we want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch our videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy our content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. The cop asked for additional help over the phone to his lieutenant. He was told to lock the area and keep the victim's room closed off from the other residents while he waited for help. In addition to Beverly, the victim's other roommates who were present at the incident were Carrie Duane, 19, and Paul Robinson, 23, who had recently started dating. Rita and her roommates lived in a 3-story duplex apartment building. The first-floor apartment, which was accessed from the left side of the building, had the address 17 Brooks Avenue. The second and third floors, which had 2 apartments each, were represented by the address 15 Brooks Avenue and were accessed from the right side. Rita and Beverly's bedroom was located down the short corridor behind the other, while Carrie and Paul's bedroom was located directly off the living room. Officer Garrow was ordered to canvass the neighborhood to see if anyone had heard anything as he remained stationed at the door until 7 a.m., when investigators arrived on the site to start their formal investigation. Officer Guerra went to the 3rd level and spoke with 31-year-old William Darius and his new wife, Michelle Darius, after he was unable to get in touch with anyone on the 2nd floor. Michelle informed Officer Guraus that until she noticed the police cars, she had neither heard nor seen anything and had no idea that anything sinister was happening. When questioned further, Mrs. DeRue indicated that she had been up since around 1 in the morning and that she had not heard any strange sounds, despite the couple's adamant claims to the contrary. William, her spouse, made the same comment. After being questioned, other nearby witnesses remained silent. Soon later, at around 4:20 a.m., the medical examiner doctor was joined by police. When Harris composed his first report, he mentioned how provocatively the body had been arranged. When Rita was found, she was on her back, her legs wide and her arms outstretched, forming an X shape. She had suffered from severe head trauma, mostly on her left side, leaving her with multiple dried blood-stained cuts and contusions. Multiple blunt force injuries to the face and head were evident. Detectives saw that Rita's hair was strewn all over her head and that torn hair strands were visible on the floor nearby, as if they had been torn from her scalp during the assault. Rita had severe bruises on the insides of both her right and left legs, as well as one above her right knee, according to the medical examiner. An autopsy later on would determine that the cause of death was manual strangulation asphyxia. It was also discovered that the murderer had recently injured and bruised her lower body, suggesting that she had also been sexually attacked. According to toxicity studies, she had no alcohol in her bloodstream. Rita was wearing a housecoat with buttons on it that had been ripped apart at the front during the struggle, leaving several buttons missing and strewn all over the floor. In order to preserve the physical relics on the victim's hands and arms, the housecoat was severed from the body. Rita's nightgown was ripped open from front to back, with the lower portion located in the closet doorway and the upper portion wrapped under her shoulder and back. Her underwear was torn from her corpse and discovered under her left leg, together with an unidentified paper bag. Moreover, an afghan, a bedspread, and a white bedsheet were placed underneath her and knotted around her left leg. The handmade afghan blanket and the bleeding sheet and bedspread were bagged by the police. They discovered that Rita had one long strand of hair in her right hand and several strands in her left. In addition, they collected several hair strands off Rita's head for preliminary comparison and bagged the hair that was discovered on the ground. Rita's right elbow had a Lark cigarette butt below it, which was discovered when her body was examined. There were indications on this cigarette that it had been abandoned and spontaneously burned out. It lay buried deep in its own ash. Later, blood samples were extracted from a section of the flooring by crime scene technicians. Rita, who was always well-groomed and put together, had worn hair curlers to bed in anticipation of the following day, according to Beverly, who reported this to the police. In addition to working part-time as a maid at Colonial Motor Inn, she was enrolled in summer graduate studies at the nearby University of Vermont. Rita, trying to be more social, had joined a neighborhood barbershop quartet and was practicing with them until roughly 10 o'clock every day, just like she had on July 19th before heading home and into her final bed. The curlers Rita had painstakingly applied were discovered thrown in the room's corner close to the stereo. There were numerous broken and damaged hair strands in the curlers, which led the detectives to conclude that the curlers had been roughly pulled from her head. Police speculated that during the attack, the killer, whose motive was unknown, yanked Rita's hair curlers off of her head and hurled them into the corner. The stereo belonging to the roommate was upside down in the rear left corner, close to the speakers and the broken hair curlers. The drapes that had been hanging in the window near the same part of the room where the hair rollers were discovered with such pride had been pulled off their rod and were now resting on the stereo. On the otherwise spotless floor, there was also a noticeable amount of grime. To compare the dirt on the victim's room floor with the dirt in the shared residence's cellar, a sample of the latter was collected. Furthermore, a sizable piece of wood that they thought contained blood was taken from the bedroom door. The hard flooring was also examined by police for fingerprints. Rita's roommates all stated that after checking their acquaintance, nothing further was touched, but as per police protocol, their prints were obediently obtained for exclusionary purposes. Beverly knew their shared room well, and she estimated that the bed had been pushed about a foot towards the left wall. Based on this information, the detectives concluded that the most of the altercation had place on the right side of the bed. Beverly had a desk on the right wall and a shared dresser was on the other side. But nothing interesting turned up on either. On the door leading out of the room, blood was found. There was apparent blood on the exterior of the kitchen door, but other than that, there were no disturbances in the living room, kitchen, or bathroom areas where Paul and Carrie had been. There were no indications of trespassing or fighting in the shared rear yard and porch area of the duplex. On the lower panel and top center of the rear door, however, blood drippings were discovered by the police. It was believed that this blood belonged to the murderer, who was most likely bleeding out as he fled after suffering an injury during the attack. When police looked into the right side driveway, they couldn't find any footprints in the sand, which would have meant that no one had entered since the precipitation the night before. No footprints or other evidence was found in the grassy area of the driveway. The cobwebs were still hanging from the cellar windows, suggesting that they had not been opened. It had been a while since anyone had opened the back entrance of the cellar. Whether someone had been in the backyard or not was unclear from the state of the grass. After that, they looked over the left side of the home, but they were unable to locate a potential entrance. Police stated that it was improbable that the murderer would use the bedroom window near to the front door, even if it was unlocked and extremely difficult to open. The storm door was open, and the back door was determined to be closed but unlocked. Investigators noticed a gray wastebasket in the porch area and shed that was knocked over and looked like it had been trodden on. The basket's contents were strewn all over the floor. There was also another wastebasket, white in color, but it was empty. Investigators questioned whether the roommate's presence had been observed via the windows using the wastebaskets as a means of peering in. Roommate Paul Robinson went back to the apartment around 6 in the morning to talk with cops while the scene was being examined. He clarified that the numerous trash cans that had been discovered toppled had been left outside on the back porch the previous evening with the intention of emptying them later. With a guilty smile, he said that he had also propped up their storm door with the wastebasket for unidentified reasons. He expressed concern that this could have made the killer's entrance easier. He continued, nevertheless, by stating that it was the roommate's common understanding that all apartment doors remained unlocked. He claimed throughout the chat that all of the housemates were close, but he didn't know that Rita or Beverly smoked cigarettes. Paul was positive that neither he nor Carrie had ever smoked Lark's brand, even though he and Carrie admitted to occasionally smoking Winston's or Benson and Hodges. Because such a brand of cigarette is unique, this was a question that was raised several times. Investigators were hoping that such an oddity might identify the assailant. Paul acknowledged that the flat was vulnerable since the front door's chain lock was broken and has been for a while when asked about other people's access. With evident enthusiasm and anxiety that their own behaviors might have contributed to the security breach, he readily acknowledged all of this. Paul was questioned by detectives to get more information about his past activities with his girlfriend. After some time, Paul was released without being questioned further because his account corroborated the information in his signed statement and the statements of his roommates, who were interviewed separately in accordance with police protocol, which states that suspects should not be questioned together to prevent cooperative deception. Carrie reported that evening at 7:30 p.m., Paul picked her up from work. They then drove around for a while, coming home to change clothes, and then going again at about 8:50 p.m. for dinner at Harbor Hideaway. At approximately 11:15 p.m., they called Rita's roommate Beverly from that pub and invited her over for a drink. Rita was sleeping in their shared room, according to Beverly, so she walked out without waking her and proceeded to the pub with the others. At 11:20 p.m., Beverly departed from the flat. The last person to saw Rita alive was her. After Beverly arrived at Harbor Hideaway for about an hour, Paul mentioned that he was exhausted and that he and Carrie were going home to sleep. They remember returning to the apartment at 12:30 a.m. and spending some time in the living room before going to their bedroom to spend the night. Although they claimed not to have seen anything strange, they did note that Rita and Beverly's room door was slightly ajar, about 12 inches. Since Rita was sleeping, Beverly claims she closed the door on her way out of courtesy. Based on this scenario, investigators came to the conclusion that Rita was murdered between around 11:20 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. during the 70 minutes that passed between Beverly's departure and Paul and Carrie's return home. According to detectives, Rita's roommates' comings and goings were natural, thus there were no preparations for the killer to utilize to trap her. Rita was left alone for just 70 minutes, which meant that it was unlikely that the culprit happened to happen upon the victim by accident. It took that long to go home. They believed that the crime was more likely to have been committed by someone who lived close by and was aware of the residents' driving habits and routines, making it possible to keep track of who was coming and departing. Despite the thin connection, detectives investigated all the guys named in the initial allegations because they thought Reardon knew the criminal. Re-examining the data, investigators found that William Darius, 31, lived on the third floor of Rita's apartment and had at least 3 prior contacts with the police on unrelated matters. He and his spouse exchanged an alibi, saying they were both at home and had not heard or seen anything, despite the fact that he had also been referenced multiple times throughout the neighborhood canvass. William DeRuse was also suggested as a potential person of interest 9 days after the murder on July 28th. The confidential informant claimed that the newlywed, who had only been married for 3 weeks, was, quote, capable of committing a violent act. Authorities found it interesting that William's wife was 24 years old, Rita's age. Despite the informant's accusation and William's close vicinity to the crime site, detectives were unable to locate any evidence connecting the spouse to the scene, even though the 2 women had no prior history of interaction. William was never formally examined as a person of interest because there were no concrete damning artifacts, and blood analysis and DNA fingerprinting were not included in investigative efforts until 1980. Cold case status would shortly set in. A team of cold case investigators investigated Rita's murder more than 40 years later with the goal of using new DNA technology to identify a potential culprit. As is becoming more and more common, carefully maintained artifacts for future generations to interpret and decode served as the evidence that ultimately identified the murderer. The task team was forced to separate the physical evidence into two categories due to the high cost of the testing required to separate and identify the artifacts from the crime scene. The items in Group 1 are the most likely to yield DNA results: a piece of linoleum with blood stains, Rita's underwear, a portion of her nightgown, the housecoat, 2 pieces of wood, and 2 cloth drawstrings from the housecoat she wore both during and after the attack were among the encouraging pieces of evidence. While the blood samples from 1971 were too diluted and degraded to create profiles, the distinct presence of the used Lark cigarette would prove to be the break detectives needed. Group 2 contained items that were less likely to provide a complete suspect DNA profile, mainly the hair curlers and the rest of the bedding. In 2014, the Chief Medical Examiner's Office in New York City received samples of the cigarette butt, fingernail scrapings, and bodily fluid slides taken during Rita's autopsy for DNA analysis. Cold case investigators learned of the recovery of a male DNA profile from the cigarette butt around the end of October 2014. It was added to the databases of OCME, the NDIS, and the SDIS when it was determined to be appropriate for comparison. It had also been added to the CODIS system, according to confirmation from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in New York. There was not enough DNA present on 4 of the 8 tested slides to allow for testing. For unknown reasons, possibly financial, the fingernail scrapings were not examined. Ultimately, a new lead was found in 2019 during the reinvestigation of an almost half-century-old cold case. Witness testimonies and the case file follow-up led police to conclude that William DeRouse should be added to the suspect pool so they could compare DNA samples from the cigarette butt due to his close proximity to the murder and tenuous alibi. Now that the known DNA profile was available, a large number of suspects were evaluated and eliminated via CODIS exclusion, direct comparison, or familial comparison. Prior to the arrival of the first detective, Rita's roommate Paul Robinson and other first responders were also compared to the cigarette sample. Everyone was left out. They even ran Ted Bundy's DNA profile against the cigarette located under Rita's arm. Even though Bundy's method of operation differed from Rita's indoor attack, it was impossible to overlook his relentless hold on American women in the 1970s. And for many years, some people suspected that Rita was one of his early victims. Rita's sister even sent a letter to Bundy's prison on Florida's death row, inquiring as to whether or not he had murdered her sister. The FBI responded by telling her that Bundy had chosen not to admit or deny his involvement. When FBI officials questioned Bundy on the eve of his execution in 1989, he categorically denied any participation in the case. His DNA was later compared to Rita's bedroom profile, but there was no match. To create the DNA profile from the cigarette butt, the cold case detectives collaborated with top genome sequencing company DNA Labs. In 2022, they sent the DNA profile and the cigarette butt to Parabon Nanolabs, where it was successfully sequenced and uploaded to Family Tree DNA and GED Match for genetic genealogy forensics. William DeRouse was included on the list of suspects that Parabon Nanolab officials requested in August 2022 because of the information uncovered in the 2019 investigation update. The genetic makeup of his family was contrasted with that of the sample. The findings showed that Rita's upstairs neighbor had a high confidence match with DNA ties to both his paternal and maternal sides of the family. Eventually, the team was able to confirm a familial relationship by doing additional DNA tests against Douglas McGinty, the surviving half-brother. The confirmation yielded a certainty of 100%. To find out if the remaining housemates knew William or his wife Michelle at the time, investigators conducted follow-up interviews with them. Police were saddened to discover that Beverly Lanfear had gone away and never heard of any new case developments, even though Paul and Carrie had been found and remembered having no substantial interactions with the upstairs neighbor. Detectives traveled to Oregon in September 2022 to meet with William's ex-wife Michelle, who was known by her legal name at the time of the crime but is now known as Kailis Nagarjawan. She was reminded, now in her mid-70s, that she and William had first met in 1970, less than 2 years before to the murder. Although she acknowledged that she didn't know as much as she should have about her husband, she remembered that he had told her that he had served 2 to 3 years in prison for armed robbery, the longest sentence he had ever received. Only 2 weeks had passed since the couple's marriage to their downstairs neighbor's house. The ex-wife of William claims she has no memory of ever knowing or even seeing the neighbors. She claims she didn't recognize Rita when shown a picture of her. She says that although William was bossy and overly protective, he wanted her to get pregnant as soon as possible. However, the now elderly woman remembered almost warmly that William's main objective was to operate a barbershop and have a big family with her. She insisted that the man who is now believed to have fatally strangled a young teacher had never physically abused her and that she had never been terrified of him. She said that since he was a devout Buddhist and a teetotaler, such a change in personality could not be explained by drink or drugs. In 1971, she recalled seeing police officers at the flat. She claims that the morning following the murder, before going door to door, her new husband William warned her not to bring up the fact that he wasn't home since the police might try to incriminate him due to his earlier criminal record. She claims that the two got into a fight the night of the murder, but she was unable to recall the specifics of the argument. Contrary to her first and persistent public assertion, she acknowledged that her then-husband had actually briefly left their flat during a period of time when Rita's housemates were also absent. She remembers that William departed for what he claimed to be a cool-down walk, but upon his return, he warned his wife not to mention that he had left the house at all, claiming that the police would go after him due to his criminal history. She does not provide a reason other than spousal loyalty for her decision to withhold such important and relevant facts. She remembers that she might have slept off while William was gone and didn't know how long he had been gone. She slept next to him later that night and noticed he slept in later than normal the following morning, but she did not remember anything unusual. She was also unable to recall what he had on that night or whether he had shed any clothes. She claimed that she would have called the police if she had been confident that William had been involved. She later acknowledges, though, that given their chat, it's possible she would have provided quotation coverage for her new spouse in any subsequent interviews. She acknowledges that she did consider the possibility that her new husband was the one who perpetrated the horrible act, but she claims she never asked him directly and assumed he had no motive to do it. She mentioned that although she didn't smoke, he did, but she couldn't remember the brand. William moved to Thailand abruptly not long after the murder. When asked why William moved to Thailand without her, the ex-wife was perplexed and suggested that perhaps they didn't have enough money. The couple had an arrangement that they would eventually move to Thailand together. She should have seen red signals when it came to his departure from the nation and the fact that she was already skeptical of his nightly walk, according to critics of her blissful ignorance. She claims that a few months after the murder, in March 1972, she followed William to Thailand. William, according to her, was a Buddhist monk residing at a monastery at that point. She remembers that finally he lost his monastic title and that the couple went on a short trip that lasted a few weeks after he lost his religious standing. William was eventually readmitted as a monk and his wife converted to nunhood. Consequently, their marriage disintegrated due to stringent relationship requirements. William asked her for financial support throughout his travels, but she turned him down, so they didn't speak or interact again. They were officially divorced in absentia because she was unable to get William's signature on their divorce papers. To resolve the issue, she hired a divorce lawyer. She told officers again at the end of the interview that she could not remember ever talking to her neighbors, much less having them into her flat. Rita became quite emotional, according to the cops, after seeing photos of herself and her roommates from the time of the murder. Subsequently, investigators took a plane to Colorado to meet Sarah Hepting, the third wife of William DeRue and her spouse. 3 years after Rita's death, in July 1974, Sarah recalls moving to San Francisco, California, when she first met William DeRue. Paradoxically, he showed interest in her and lived next door in her apartment building. He had stated that he had been married before and that he had been to Thailand, but he never gave an explanation for his departure, nor did he discuss his family history or whether he had children. According to Sarah, they both identified as hippies. On November 19, 1974, they were married, but at the time, Sarah acknowledged that she was uneasy and unsure about the exclusivity of their relationship. William was generally well-mannered, according to Sarah, but she did mention a few concerning instances. For example, one day when a mutual acquaintance dropped by, William pulled out a big pocket knife and stabbed the man in the side without warning. After Sarah brought the injured person to the hospital, William was placed under arrest. He went back home the next day and like nothing had happened. He even asked if he had actually stabbed Sarah, to which she replied that he had actually stabbed their friend. William showed no regret for the incident, and they never talked about it again. Another time, when they'd been drinking, he'd almost choked Sarah senseless. Sarah couldn't remember how their argument started. William acquired an AR-15 at some point in 1976, and Sarah thought he was arrested by the federal government for obtaining one of these weapons. As a result, he was missing for almost a week. But unlike the past incidents, William never talked to her about this one. Sarah could not remember his ever having mentioned Vermont as his home. She claims that, despite his unpredictable nature, she was drawn to him since he was a highly powerful guru with the capacity to exert control over others. Sarah remembered William smoking cigarettes, but she couldn't remember which brand he smoked. She acknowledged that they occasionally went out, but their limited funds kept them from buying strong narcotics. She also notes that during their relationship, William drank a lot of alcohol, and she surmises that he also frequently took Thorazine. Adults with specific mental health disorders can be treated with Thorazine. It can benefit those exhibiting symptoms like agitation, delusions, or hallucinations. Thorazine improves mental health by altering the chemical equilibrium in the brain. Yet, if dosage is not taken correctly, the opposite effect may occur, causing William to act irrationally and boldly. When Sarah discovered William was having an affair in 1978, she decided to break up with him. She moved and began living with a new partner in a matter of months. She remembers William acting suspiciously when he unexpectedly showed up at her house one day. Sarah claims that because she didn't know how he got her new address, she felt uncomfortable. Fortunately for her, he moved on the next day and she didn't see him again. In 1986, William overdosed severely on morphine and died in San Francisco. His body was incinerated and there is no testable biological evidence from him. He would have been 83 years old when the media was informed of his guilt. He was let to pass away by the means of his own choosing rather than facing criminal charges for his horrible actions. Although Rita's surviving family members and friends would have preferred justice to be served in court, they recognize that family members frequently cannot receive such answers because forensic genetic testing is so exclusive. As a result, they are appreciative of the closure that the cold case detectives brought about, even after decades of searching for answers. Grace and patience are two qualities that Rita Patricia Curran is recognized for. She is praised by both students and co-workers as the ideal teacher, someone who was always eager to assist others. When the identity of Rita's killer was finally revealed in late February 2023, she would have been 76 years old. Rita was born in the summer of 1947 and was tragically removed from this world too soon in the summer of 1971. After over 50 years, the oldest cold case in Vermont was concluded. Moving on to the next case. Maury Troy Travis. Maury Troy Travis, age 36. His murders were so awful that anyone who would even view the recordings of his victims would have to undergo psychological counseling, according to the local police chief. He would entice victims down his cellar, where he would perform strange rites and subject them to unspeakable torment. What motivated Maury Travis to carry out such heinous deeds? How did he get his victims to enter his basement undetected? Maury Travis, the main character of today's tale, was born on October 25, 1965. He went by the moniker Toby and resided at Carr Square, a public housing development in St. Louis, Missouri, with his parents, Sandra and Michael V. Travis. Later, in April 1976, they purchased a home in Ferguson at 1001 Ford Avenue. The early years of Maury Travis appeared to be somewhat typical. He was unquestionably shy and reclusive, but he was also renowned for his extraordinary civility and respect. Those who worked with him as adults thought highly of his manners and social conventions. Maury was described by one teacher as an exceptionally peaceful adolescent who even went so far as to trim his neighbor's grass. Teachers, parents, and peers who knew him all at school noted his average manner, never thought he was violently inclined. Many of the people who lived close to Maury or went to school with him were unaware of his identity when police questioned them afterward. He didn't make an impact that would stick. The only possible trauma he may have had during his entire known childhood was the separation from his parents. Following his 1985 McClure High School graduation, he participated in the Army Reserve for 2 years. After that, he was employed as a dental and medical assistant. He also succeeded in landing jobs locally with college-affiliated businesses and even performed volunteer work at a nearby assisted living facility. When Maury Travis, then 22, enrolled in Morris Brown College in 1986, it felt like a step in the right direction. But it was also in this exclusive facility in Atlanta that he came into contact with cocaine and developed an addiction to it, which turned his life upside down. His addiction cost him $300 per day since it soon reached a terrible degree. The following year, Maury's rapid descent into criminal activity to fund his habit caught the notice of law enforcement. Until then, he had an impeccable reputation. Therefore, it was rather unexpected that he would suddenly start acting illegally. His behavior changed dramatically and unexpectedly from what he had been doing before, instead of increasing gradually. During his college spring vacation in March 1988, Maury committed many high-profile robberies. He surprised everyone by aiming his gun at 5 St. Louis shoe stores in just 8 days. His choice of weapon gave these crimes a peculiar edge. To inspire terror, he utilized a plastic toy gun rather than a loaded one. It was somewhat surprising how quickly his behavior turned criminal, especially considering how spotless his record had been before these instances. This is the point at which Maury Travis's actions abruptly turned criminal. His first capture came about as a result of the armed robberies he conducted. Witnesses gave police information about his vehicle, which resulted in his apprehension. Maury didn't seem like the usual crook, which surprised the detective working the case. When he was caught, Maury blamed the drug's influence for his hazy memory of the crimes. He completed a drug rehabilitation program and declared himself to have recovered from his addiction while he awaited punishment. The court had taken into consideration his activities during proceedings, even with these efforts and his spotless record prior to this. Supporters of Maury's character rushed in, including one from a congressman and U.S. representative. These testimonies emphasized his efforts at rehabilitation and stated that his criminal behavior was an anomaly in his personality. On July 5, 1989, at the age of 23, Maury was sentenced to 15 years in jail in spite of this acknowledgement. His incarceration for his illegal acts began at this point. Maury knew right once that his stay behind bars wouldn't be simple. He spoke to the harsh circumstances, reporting regular beatings and a profusion of medicines that seriously jeopardized his chances of recovery. He was surrounded by narcotics in this difficult setting despite having effectively dealt with his dependency difficulties. Pouring out his heart in the hopes of a more merciful verdict, Maury addressed a letter to the court, pleading with him to rethink his sentence. Maury wrote to the judge in his plea, describing how his terrible living circumstances were a regular source of thoughts about ending his life. Finally, he begged the judge to give him another opportunity to succeed in society. After serving just 5 years and 3 months at the Farmington Correctional Center, Maury was given parole in 1994. His excellent behavior was the main reason for his early release. Despite having 13 conduct infractions, they were all very minor ones. After being released from prison, he moved into a duplex where the other residents thought he was a great resident who never bothered them. Following his original jail sentence from March 1989 to June 1994, Maury was incarcerated again for drug-related offenses from February 1998 to January 1999 as a result of persistently breaking his parole. After being released from prison, he worked in a few different eateries, generally by himself. He also showed an odd obsession with his 2000 black Mitsubishi Eclipse, putting a lot of time and effort into keeping and cleaning it. Maury's classmates and neighbors had no reason to suspect anything about him, but one of his ex-girlfriends had other ideas. A boyfriend I came to love, wanted to get married to, and wanted kids with. He threatened to hurt me severely. I knew he didn't know me, sweetheart. Did you consider that perhaps I didn't know him when he said, "You don't know me?" I knew I had to go immediately. He was an extremely lovely individual. He gave me encouragement and assisted me in regaining my self-worth. Following Maury's girlfriend's departure in March 2001, bodies of women started to appear in the area. Maury would aggressively pick up prostitutes along the long stretch of Broadway known as the Stroll, north of St. Louis, between March 2001 and May 2002. In actuality, 4 of Maury's alleged victims were subsequently found nearby. It became well known for having a large number of crack homes and for having these workers available. After picking them up, Maury would return them to his Ferguson residence. When he arrived, he would hold some of these women for several days, allowing his whims to control them. But it wasn't just for his own gratification. He took notes on the terrifying things that were happening in the basement. Maury was shown in a few of the videotapes acting out a consenting but brutal role-play of being a woman's bondage. He has also been observed using narcotics on occasion, although he never hurt them. But in other video, Maury was shown engaging in much more sinister pursuits, like as holding women captive in his dungeon for days on end and strangling them until they died. At first, law officials found it difficult to understand why he decided to spare some women. However, one theory argues that the turning moment may have been when he learned that a specific sex worker had children. Given that they prioritized drugs over their kids, it seems that this realization sent him into a furious frenzy. That's the inference they've made, though it's not confirmed. In addition, he forced them to follow the most absurd routines. More often than not, he would make them dance while wearing all-white attire. Occasionally, he would also make them don eyeglasses with totally opaque lenses so they would be blind. He was totally removing their power by doing this. Then, he would handcuff them and use a rope to immobilize their legs. Sometimes he would even put duct tape over their eyes. They discovered video recordings of these women being verbally taunted by Maury while they were tied to a wooden pole. He would either inform them what was going to happen, or they would have to chastise him too. Occasionally, he would become enraged upon discovering that these women were parents. Additionally, he used to chastise them for acting violently and aggressively against their children since they preferred doing drugs. Maury is actually shown standing over a kneeling, nude lady who is tied and firmly bound with a rope in some of the early film. He then pulls the belt out of nowhere, snaps it tight around her neck, and strangles her till she becomes limp and asleep. He might have even fractured her neck. Then he simply drops her body onto the ground, face down. The idea that Maury Travis was able to commit such heinous murders without drawing attention to himself is really terrifying. We do know that Maury Travis was a master of disguise because of his ability to fit in with his surroundings. Because of his quiet demeanor and ability to go unnoticed, he was the last person anybody would suspect of doing such horrible atrocities. The first recorded victim, Mary Shields, aged 61, was found on July 31, 2000. In East St. Louis, Illinois, a startling trend started. The catastrophes worsened in the months that followed. Cassandra F. Walker, 19, was discovered dead in Washington Park, Illinois on March 24, 2001. On April 1, 2001, Alyssa Greenway, 34, who was enmeshed in an apparently hopeless cycle of addiction, was found dead in Washington Park, Illinois. There were ligature marks on her ankles and wrists indicating that she had been strangled. Authorities discovered a tire imprint close to her body that was recognized as a Bridgestone Potenza tire and photographed for additional examination. Teresa Wilson, 36, was found shortly after on May 15, 2001 in West Alton, Missouri. Betty James, 46, was found in St. Louis on May 30, 2001, and had a tire impression that was clearly visible, unlike previous incidents. That because the killings were carried out in a similar way, all of these murders were committed by the same person. Verona Thompson, 36, was located in West Alton, Missouri by June 29, 2001. After that, 50-year-old Yvonne Cruz was found in East St. Louis, Illinois on August 25, 2001. The eerie quiet that followed Brenda Beasley's 33-year-old body's discovery in East St. Louis, Illinois on October 8, 2001. Conjecture about race. 3 hypotheses were postulated by the authorities. The offender had either disappeared, been taken into custody, or moved out of the region. But once the year turned over, the eerie silence ended. And then the cycle continued, taking 4 more lives. On January 30, 2002, the first unidentified victim was discovered. On March 28, 2002, a second unidentified body was found in Columbia, Illinois, and on May 25, 2002, a final unidentified victim was reported from West Alton, Missouri. Every day was a somber moment that eventually revealed a horrifying pattern. What finally happened to catch the murderer will astound you beyond belief. Bill Smith wrote an article in an effort to retain public interest in the case and draw attention to one of the victims. This was the story of victim Teresa Wilson's hardships in life before her tragic death. The killer was dubbed the Streetwalker Strangler by him. The paper published the article in its May 19, 2002 issue. Smith found a letter at his desk less than a week later. Although letters and other mail are frequently received by media people, the envelope for this particular letter had an odd return address. Lafayette Street, New York, New York, 325, 331. The letter was postmarked 112, St. Louis, indicating that it was mailed locally. Parts of Manhattan's Soho, NoHo, Nolita, and Greenwich Village neighborhoods are included in the zip code Wastrid 12. The letter had been mailed locally because it had a postmark from St. Louis. The address in Ithreldom, nevertheless, is fictitious. So why would someone refer to an address using that term? As defined by Merriam-Webster, thraldom is the condition of being a slave. It was also the name of a website devoted to bondage. The letter was typewritten in red ink with minimal punctuation using what looked to be Lucida's handwriting font. At first, Smith thought it was a joke. After reading the letter, which began, "Dear Bill, nice sob story about Teresa Wilson," he soon realized it was not a joke and that the person claiming to be the streetwalker was real. Compose one pertaining to Greenway. If you write a decent one, I will tell you where many more are, only to establish my legitimacy. Here are the directions to 17. From the X, search a radius of 50 yards. Like last time, publish the story in the Sunday paper. The letter Bill got included a map of West Alton with a body's location marked with an X. This correspondent promised to disclose the whereabouts of more casualties and, as proof of identity, enclosed a typewritten map produced by the Internet and directions to number 17. Authorities concentrated on the map, which seemed to have been created using an online mapping tool after discovering a skeleton at the designated location. An FBI agent, Melanie Jimenez's affidavit, states that they discovered a potential match on Expedia.com. Expedia notified Jimenez on May 30, 2002, that Redmond, Washington-based Microsoft supplied the information for its map website. Any maps of West Alton created between May 18, 2002, the date of the newspaper article that sparked the letter, and May 21, 2002, the postmark on the envelope, were sought by the FBI. The response took 4 days to arrive. Microsoft stated on June 3, 2002 that throughout the allotted time, only one machine had accessed the map. The business also disclosed that it had access to the map on May 20, 2002 for the predetermined amount of time. After roughly 10 chronological zooms in on the West Alton, Missouri area map, the computer produced a map that was identical to the one that was given to the Post-Dispatch. Microsoft could only offer an IP address. They were unable to furnish a name. 65.227.106.78 is a string of numbers that most people find meaningless. The FBI contacted WorldCom Inc. or SOS, which supplied local phone lines to link internet services to their dial-up customers, in order to convert the IP number into a name. For every internet session, WorldCom issues a temporary IP address to every customer. Finding the person who used 65.227.106.78 at the particular moment in question was just as difficult as figuring out who used it. Maury Travis, an MSN / was recognized as the user by WorldCom's internet division, UUNet. As a result, Maury Troy Travis of Ferguson, the user's true name, was discovered. Prior to this, in 2001, Maury also made hints to a coworker about his criminal activity. He informed him that because there were less police officers in East St. Louis, it was an excellent spot to hide items. He told the girlfriend of a coworker as well, who was employed by a TV station, that the corpses of prostitutes were disposed of nearby. Although Maury claimed to have learned of their deaths from a friend, he refrained from admitting to being their killer. Maury may have been an attention-seeking serial killer, based on his taunting letter to the editor and his clues to colleagues. His behavior suggests a need to be discovered as well as a warped feeling of authority stemming from the terror he inspired in the neighborhood. This data served as the foundation for surveillance, an arrest warrant, and a search on June 7, 2002. The warrant resulted in the finding of evidence that connected 36-year-old waiter Maury to some of the killings, including tire markings and DNA. After conducting a thorough investigation of Maury's Ferguson, Missouri home, investigators discovered a horrific scene. They found a torture chamber hidden in the basement of his house. His house's ground level was neat and well kept. His roommate, who went by the name of his girlfriend, told the authorities she had never been in the basement and had no idea what it was like. Maury was questioned by FBI agents and other investigators in his living room for 2 hours, as police officers searched the home and basement. They discovered that the house belonged to his mother, who had given him permission to stay there. Instead, they asked how they had found him. When he was told they had arrived at his doorstep thanks to the computer-printed map, Maury lost his cool. Not long after being led outside and put in a car by the police, Maury agreed to go downtown with them to be questioned in more detail. When computer forensics specialists went to look through Maury's computer, they found early versions of the letter he had sent to reporter Bill Smith. A house of horrors was discovered by detectives. They discovered bloodstains on the carpet, furniture, walls, and ceiling. This contained terrifying torture devices, a scary stun pistol, and newspaper cuttings detailing his horrible actions. The most unsettling finding, though, was still to come. Video recordings of Maury's horrifying deeds of violence in which his victims are subjected to terrible acts. In addition to DNA research indicated that he was responsible for the deaths of 12 to 20 women. Between 2000 and 2022, he had been preying on gullible people in the states of Missouri and Illinois. Many of them were drug addicts and sex workers. Travis made a beverage request while being questioned. The can he drank from was then taken to the laboratory for analysis. DNA samples were collected from the vicinity of the can's opening. Travis's saliva contained epithelial cells that might be utilized in DNA testing. Next, the biological material discovered on 2 of the murder victims, Brenda Beasley and Yvonne Cruz, was compared to Travis's DNA profile. Investigators also discovered a rudimentary diagram in Maury's house that displayed blueprints for an addition to the basement, according to St. Louis Police Captain Harry Heeger. According to Heeger, Maury intended to construct 2 chambers in the basement where he could, and after that, he planned to construct vents to connect the inside of the basement to the exterior. Hager claimed that Maury had also compiled a list of necessities, including adult diapers, in order to hold the woman captive for a while. We discussed the victims who have been named, but let's now learn about a handful who are still unknown. The terrible St. Charles County Jane Doe case was made public on May 25, 2002. The woman's identity remained unknown for 21 years after her bones were found close to West Alton, Missouri, adding another victim to the list of people killed by serial killer Maury Troy Travis. Jane Doe's story in St. Charles County was revealed after an anonymous letter to local reporter Bill Smith on May 21, 2002, was received. The bones of Jane Doe, the St. Charles County resident, were discovered strewn over a 30-foot wide area to the west of Highway 67. It was established that she was a black woman, roughly 5 feet 4 in height, and between the ages of 25 and 35. None of the hands, nor one or more limbs, were found. A black and silver V-neck stretch shirt with 3/4-length sleeves, a sleeveless coarse blouse denim dress with metal buttons, a black spandex top, a torn piece of blue jean-type material, a white cotton tube sock, a blue shoestring-type tie-up in the back, and a thin white cotton fragment were among the remains discovered at the crime scene. March 28, 2002, a few months earlier, was the date of another discovery: the body parts of an unknown woman. She became known as Monroe County Jane Doe, and she was one of the 3 people that infamous St. Louis serial killer Maury Travis killed. Her identity is still unknown. Her narrative veiled in silence. Her skin tone revealed her African American ancestry, and it was assumed that she was between the ages of 29 and 50. Her height was 5 feet 1 inch. She was quite small, standing at 105 pounds. Her forehead had a repaired fracture marked in her dark brown hair, which may have been from an injury sustained as a child. She had never given birth as far as was known. When they found her, all they could find were skeletal remnants, paired with an orange letter M and the word Mavericks printed on a green shirt. Khaki canvas shorts and a brown leather belt with a silver clasp finished off her outfit. The only indications of her identity that these plain clothes offered were as mute witnesses to her life. A few weeks prior to that, on March 11, 2002, Madison County Jane Doe's remains were discovered in Marine, Illinois. Jane Doe of Madison County was estimated to be between 23 and 30 years old. She self-identified as black. She weighed about 105 pounds and was estimated to be between 5'1" and 5'6". Her hair was likewise dark. The body of the deceased was found to be wearing gray second skins shorts and a red and white checkered plaid top with the Tommy Hilfiger brand on it. On January 30, 2002, St. Clair County Jane Doe, a lady whose identity is still unknown, was found. Although the precise reason of her death is still unknown, her skeletal bones were discovered in Mascoto, Illinois. She is thought to be one of serial killer Maury Troy Travis's unnamed victims. She was thought to be of African American ethnicity and between the ages of 20 and 40 at the time of her discovery. Her 3 right ear piercings, a repaired fracture above her left ankle, and other healed fractures on her nasal bones, left second rib, wrist, and below her neck, were among the skeletal remnants that provided clues about her life. She was discovered with her legs fully extended and wearing a black velour sleeveless catsuit with the Jason Matthews brand on it. Her left middle finger had 2 yellow metal rings on it. People couldn't believe that such a charming man could be so smart. May have something to do with these horrible crimes. The mother of one of his former Pagedale girlfriends voiced her surprise and incredulity at hearing of Maury's arrest. He was characterized by her daughter, who dated him in 2001, as the epitome of a perfect gentleman who was always content and easygoing. She found it hard to accept that the man she knew could be someone else from the one who was being held indicted for such horrible acts. And 2 further charges of kidnapping were brought against him. Documents from federal courts connect him to these offenses. According to police detectives, Maury may have killed up to 17 women in all. After being detained for questioning on June 7, 2002, Maury was put on preventive surveillance until his trial for the accused offenses. After Maury was arrested on June 7, 2002, St. Louis believed that justice had been done. However, darkness returned to the city. On June 10, 2002, 3 days later, Maury made plans to evade his sentencing. In the most unbelievable way imaginable, he accomplished it. It was said that in his Clayton jail cell on the 8th floor, Maury Travis penned a short note on a piece of paper. Another prisoner assigned to look over Maury tried to monitor him through a window outside the cell. Maury had no wish to be imprisoned for the rest of his life or to be put to death by injection. He explained to anyone who would read his parting remarks. Rather, he made the decision to pass away at his own discretion. According to his explanation, he left a note to prove that, "You guys didn't kill me." He wrote in his note, "Dear Mom, I apologize for the hurt this has caused you and your family. The only way out seems to be my death, and a quick method to put a stop to all the publicity. I've been mentally ill for a while, yet you were the best mother a man could have, since I was around 14 years old. I was just sick and I'm not sure why. Never in my life have I felt content or normal. I reflect on my life and the journey ahead of me. I won't have to spend the rest of my life in a cell or, worse, have a needle put to my head, so this seems like the wisest course of action for everyone concerned, including myself. I love you all very much, Grandma, Marina, James, and everyone else. You already know that I adore you the most. Toby Travis, you're my son forever." Prison rules prevented the prisoner assigned to the anti-self-harm vigil from having a clear view of what was going to happen, and the guards broke the rules by skipping 2 15-minute checkpoints, giving Maury 45 minutes to execute his plan in peace. Maury painstakingly wove a ripped strip of bedsheet through tiny holes in a jail wall vent, 6 feet from the ground, according to Clayton police, then encircled his neck with the other end. He covered his head with a pillowcase, shoved more fabric in his mouth, and somehow tied his hands behind his back. The house where Maury perpetrated his heinous deeds in 2014 was still owned by his mother, Sandra Travis, 12 years after Maury passed away in prison. She didn't disclose the house's troubled past when she rented it to Katrina McGaw. McGaw watched a television documentary to learn about the history of the house. She asked to have her lease broken. Sandra declined. Sandra told News 4 that she had told McGaw about the history of the house. McGaw refuted this, saying that if Sandra had told her about the killings, she would have recalled them. In theory, landlords are not required to reveal details regarding the history of a property. Landlords are only required to disclose physical faults in this country. After acting, the St. Louis Housing Authority granted McGaw permission to vacate at the end of the current month, in spite of Sandra's protests. The circumstances were intricate. As the mother of a serial killer, Sandra's desire to move past her past was understandable on the one hand. While she may legally rent the residence without providing any background information, it might not be morally right to do so. Mega, on the other hand, felt uneasy in a home where women were raped and killed. She had a daughter who was 2 years old. She also said that Maury Travis tied up his victims in the basement pool where her daughter had been sometimes playing. McGaw wanted to leave as quickly as possible, appropriately, given how upsetting the whole thing was. The victims, sadly, never got any closure. To further compound the tragedy of this case, a number of victims are yet unidentified. One thing becomes clear after seeing these sad incidents. You can never be sure who is living next door. This hideous person was committing these horrible deeds directly in front of everyone, going unnoticed even by those who were close to him. The enigma around his conduct is what's so puzzling. How on earth did he manage to carry out 17 killings in his basement without anyone knowing? Not even the girl he was seeing. And lastly, the greatest mystery. In that prison cell, why did he decide to take his own life? Were the suffering these women endured and the reality of incarceration more horrifying? Or was he such a narcissist that he found it intolerable for anybody else to determine the end of his life? There are more questions than answers in this instance. Post your ideas in the comments section below. Moving on to the next case. The Jividan family murders. The family dog, Michelle and Jerica Hundley, as well as 37-year-old U.S. Air Force veteran Brandon Jividan and his 22-year-old girlfriend Rebecca Adams vanished out of their Kenai, Alaska, residence on May 27, 2014. Concerned neighbors reported to authorities on May 31st that they had not seen the family in several days. When the police showed up, they discovered that their 2 cars were parked outside and that nothing had been taken from the flat, showing no indications of forced entry or unusual activity. They left behind all of their possessions, including wallets, camping equipment, and diaper bags. The breakfast spread was still there, as though they had departed quickly. Rebecca's sister, Lynelle Adams, had been the last person to talk with her before she called the police, stating that Rebecca sounded upset. As a child, we were always taught to tell the truth at all times and to, "Thou shalt not lie," the woman remarked. "Becca, you must not lie," I asked her. "Are things going well for you?" "Don't ask me that question right now," she said. "Please know that you are loved." The family home and the surrounding region were searched, and the FBI was also included. Although search and rescue dogs and aircraft were deployed, they were nowhere to be seen. Then, less than a mile from the couple's house, the family's remains and the dog were discovered in March 2015. 2 handguns were discovered around Brandon's body at the scene as well. Authorities surmise that Brandon Jividan shot and killed his girlfriend, her children, and their dog before turning the gun on himself in a murderous suicide based on the condition of the corpses and the weaponry. Nevertheless, as the family was cohabiting peacefully, there was no reason for this. Police concluded that the incident was the result of a murderous suicide conspiracy and closed the case in June 2015, despite not being able to identify a motive. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with us. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.